Our next topic is creating a virtual machine, where we'll talk about virtual machine generations, disk types, and storage locations. Some decisions are required when building a virtual machine in Client Hyper-V. What generation VM do we need? Should we use fixed, dynamically expanding, or differencing disks for our VM? Which format should we use for those virtual hard drive files? And finally, where should we store the sometimes voluminous files that we'll be creating? So let's look at each of these decision points in a little bit more detail. First up is the subject of VM generations. On the plus side, there are only two. On the minus side, it's not always completely obvious which one is the best choice for a given situation, so let's see if we can clarify the main issues. Generation 1 VMs are the kind we've had up to now. They support virtual IDE controllers, which have the capability of connecting to virtual floppies and of using the host's physical DVD drive to sub for a virtual DVD drive. Gen 1 VMs also support virtual SCSI controllers, but only for non-boot devices. That is, you can't launch Windows from a SCSI attached drive in a Generation 1 VM. Generation 1 supports BIOS boot emulation, but not the newer UEFI boot configuration. It also supports COM ports. Some of you younger viewers might be saying, what's a COM port? And virtual floppies as well, although how useful those things are is going to be dependent on the particular applications that you might need to run in your VMs. Finally, Generation 1 VMs can run Windows XP and newer as guest operating systems, so they're pretty flexible in that regard. If you need to go way back in time, the Gen 1 VM is likely your choice. Generation 2 is newer, and it differs from Generation 1 in several respects. First, it doesn't support IDE controllers, so say goodbye to those virtual floppy drives. However, the good news is that Gen 2 virtual SCSI controllers can now boot Windows. Gen 2 supports UEFI emulation and therefore can provide secure boot capabilities that are tied to UEFI. A big gotcha is that your guest operating systems must be Windows 8 or newer, and 64-bit only. Well, the next big decision is whether to go fixed, dynamic, or differencing with the virtual hard drive. Fixed disks use the maximum allocated space immediately. If you specify a 30 gig drive, it'll occupy 30 gig of space on your host. But they can be faster, and they tend not to fragment over time. So if you need the last ounce of speed, you might prefer them. Dynamically expanding disks start small, just big enough to accommodate the files that you store on them, and they grow as required over time. If you use this type, you might give up a bit of performance, but you gain dramatically in disk space utilization. The VHDX format is strongly suggested if you go this route, as the VHD format had trouble with occasional corruption during size expansion operations. Finally, a differencing disk links to a parent of the same type, that is VHD or VHDX, and represents only changes made from the parent image. So these are really useful if you need several VMs that use a hard drive whose contents are largely the same, but only vary slightly from one VM to another. As to the format, that is VHD, VHDX, or VHDS, here's the deal on that. VHD has a size limit of 2 terabytes and supports older operating systems such as Windows 7. VHDX is the default choice. It permits a max size of 64 terabytes, but only supports Windows 8 and newer. VHDS at this recording is a bit of a mystery still, but from what Microsoft has said so far, it also supports 64 terabytes, but is just for Windows 10 and intended for shared virtual disks. Unless you need to support operating systems before Windows 8, I'd be inclined to use VHDX. Incidentally, you can convert between VHD and VHDX as long as you are living within the size constraints of VHD when going to VHD from VHDX. By the way, speaking of file types, there is a new one in Windows 10 called VMCX, but that's just a configuration file format. not a virtual hard disk format, and it works behind the scenes. You won't be creating or editing the VMCX files yourself. So where to put those files? Well, you can pick a place that works for you. Here are the defaults. For virtual disks, they go in the public profile under documents/hyper-v/virtual hard disks. The config files for the VMs live by default in the program data folder under Microsoft/Windows/Hyper-V. Checkpoints, which are snapshots of the state of a virtual machine at a particular moment. In fact, they used to be called snapshots, but the Department of Renaming inside Microsoft is ever active. They live in the same place as the config files unless you change it. Okay, well, with that background, let's build a virtual machine. Okay, so here's a client Windows 10 system that has just had Hyper-V installed on it. To gain access to the administrative tools, I go to my All Apps menu and I look for Hyper-V, and it's not there because Microsoft didn't want to make it easy. So we'll come on down and hunt for it and say, well, maybe it's under Windows something. And sure enough, Windows Administrative Tools, and I can expand this guy. And there is the Hyper-V Manager. So I can launch that tool here, and it comes up showing me that the host is laptop 1, and it doesn't find any virtual machines for the good reason that I haven't built any yet. So let's build one. We'll go over to the Actions pane and choose New Virtual Machine. Some advice here before I begin. So let's give this a name. We'll call it Engineering VM. And I have the option here to store the VM in a different location than the standard one, if I so choose. We'll accept the standard. And now here's that important decision about Generation 1 versus Generation 2 with an admonishment that once you make this decision, you can't change it. So that's an important point. Mindful of that, we'll go ahead and leave it as Generation 1 because we might want to run some old software and an old operating system on this VM. We'll set up how much memory we want to start it up with. Let's put 1024 in there, but we can leave that checkbox selected for dynamic memory. So the VM might actually use less than that if it doesn't need it. Now, if we were going to be configuring a VM for a Windows 10 or Windows 8 environment, then we might want to increase the startup memory. We can change this later on. We don't have a virtual switch set up yet, so we'll leave this as not connected. And now the virtual hard drive. So engineeringvm.vhdx is a fine name, so we'll leave that. We'll leave the default location. Again, I could change it if I wanted. And now I can come in and I can set a maximum size for this VHD. So I could come in here and say, well, I think 50 gig is going to be plenty. If I have an existing VHD, I could use that, or I could decide to attach a virtual hard drive later on. I can also create an OS at this point, so I can install an operating system from a bootable DVD. I could pop that in if I wanted, or you could specify a .iso file. We'll choose to install an operating system later. Summary page, and finish. And the VM is created.